We're back for your ears only. I'm Melissa Axelberth.
I'm David Alpern with this quote from the news. The costs are so far still on the low side compared to what will be coming under business as usual by late in this century. That was Pennsylvania State University climate scientist Richard Alley on an administration report that problems of climate change have, quote, moved firmly into the present. But new polling shows only 40% of Americans believe climate change is a major threat, compared with well more than 50% of Australians, Canadians, Germans, and French. Now this.
Shouldn't she be sleeping in a coffin somewhere?
I'm really, really hungry.
Could you smell it all the way from LA?
Coming.
Is that the really good stuff?
Precisely.
Typo. Negativo.
From Only Lovers Left Alive, the latest vampire feature at your local cinema. But Life took at least a small step towards imitating art last week as 3 new scientific studies demonstrated that young blood could energize and regenerate the cells in old brains and other organs, at least in a specific breed of mice. And at least one of the scientists is already working with a venture capital firm to turning a key protein involved into a therapy for humans.
And that wasn't the only dramatic health science news last week. Researchers at the National Cancer Institute reported sequencing the genome of a Montana woman with metastasizing cancer to find cells in her own immune system that started her tumors, quote, melting down. Experts said the process might be relevant to cancers that cause more than 80% of the nation's 580,000 cancer deaths annually. And scientists at the Scripps Research Institute in California created a living organism with additional artificially created genetic letters, raising the total from 4 to 6 and raising hopes for new ways to create vaccines, antibiotics, and even industrial products.
But it's hard to beat vampire science as inspiration for medical imagination and investigation. And to talk more about it for your ears only, we're joined by Carolyn Y. Johnson, a Boston Globe reporter who wrote about the 3 studies involved. Welcome to the program.
Thanks so much. 2
of the studies took place in your neighborhood, at Harvard to be specific, where an earlier study showed the impact of young mouse blood on old mouse hearts. Tell us about that.
The researchers use a very old technique actually called parabiosis, where they knit together the circulation systems of 2 mice of different ages, one kind of a more elderly mouse and one a young mouse. And they look at what happens. And it is a kind of a remarkable thing, but young blood has this rejuvenating effect on older mice in a variety of places, in their brains, in their hearts, and in their skeletal muscles. So they basically hook them up and watch what happens. It's surprisingly kind of a simple technique in some ways.
How did they determine which factor in the young blood was central to the rejuvenation?
They found this factor last year, actually, because they did a similar experiment and found that this particular protein called GDF11 had a rejuvenating effect on the mouse heart. So they kind of had a head start, and they began giving that to the mice alone. So instead of doing this complicated surgical procedure where they have to hook up all their blood vessels, they instead just administered this protein. And they found a lot of the same effects. It was a little bit attenuated with the protein, but it was enough that they're hopeful, and they're hoping, to keep doing more work to understand this and, eventually bring it to a clinical trial in people.
What was the nature of the study carried out at the University of California, San Francisco, which did not focus on a specific protein?
Well, they used the same technique where they hooked up the circulatory systems of the mice initially to look for effects on the brain. They were specifically looking at mouse's memory, which is, of course, of interest to us all as we get older. What they did instead of giving a specific protein was they gave the old mice repeated blood transfusions with the blood of young mice. And they found that they were able to trigger these changes with that method, too.
Talk about the Harvard researcher who's already working with a venture capital firm.
At Harvard, Amy Wagers, who's really been an up-and-coming stem cell scientist for many years, is hoping to start translating this to bring it towards application in humans. So she's working with a local venture capital firm, Atlas Venture, to try and find a way to create a therapeutic. And at this point, it's very unclear still what that would be. I mean, they might end up searching for a traditional drug that triggers this protein. They're still trying to figure out why the level of the protein decreases with age, but it kind of gives them a good handle and a good target to start with.
But you also spoke with experts who raised various caveats, starting with the mice involved.
Well, of course, everyone knows what you can do in a mouse is different than how humans will respond to a drug. Otherwise, we would have cured many diseases that are still big problems. These mice are a genetic strain that is not necessarily indicative of all mice, much less indicative of how humans would respond. So one of the experts I spoke with suggested that this be repeated in a more representative population of mice, which can seem like a detail, but, the science depends on the details.
And there were doubts about a single protein being the magic bullet.
That comes up again and again because aging is so complicated. It has so many different parts. A lot of people are skeptical that it's going to come down to one single kind of biological mechanism that can reverse it or even explain it. So this, and even the researchers themselves acknowledge that this is one piece of what is probably a very complicated mechanism that has a lot of different parts that contribute to it and maybe could be reversed. So it's a really exciting field because for the first time people are getting a handle at this very detailed molecular level about how we get old and what happens to our brains and our muscles and our hearts. But at the same time, it may be simplistic to think about it as a single drug attacking a single pathway that's going to suddenly be our fountain of youth.
We felt a little silly beginning this segment with a clip from a vampire movie, but I gather some of those involved have made the same connection.
Yeah, it was funny. I asked the scientists if they got a lot of vampire jokes, and one of them sent me an email that was an invitation to a vampire blood journal club where scientists get together and talk about new research in the blood field. And it even had a funny photo of a vampire above it inviting all the other scientists to talk about, a pretty technical paper in the field. So I think they all like us find it to be kind of an ironic or funny part of this research that, it connects in this pop culture way.
Thank you. Carolyn Y. Johnson is a health team science reporter for the Boston Globe.
You make me feel so young. Ooh, you make me feel so young.
Quote from the news, "Time to burn the beret and bury the blue dress." That was from a Vanity Fair article by former White House intern Monica Lewinsky, now 40, complaining of continuing prejudice after her affair with President Bill Clinton.
Next, Behind the Blues, musical variety for your ears only.